and welcome, Virtual Space Hero community. We are back on stage fully with topics around the hybrid work, hybrid organizations. And thank you very much for connecting. And thank you so much also for sending through all the questions that you're having and the suggestions for guests on my Virtual Space Hero LinkedIn Live show. I'm happy today because we're continuing to dive deep into the topic of hybrid organizations. And I'm more than happy to have again with me on the stage one of the leading experts who has been working remotely and consulting about remote work and hybrid work for many, many years. Why am I inviting her again? Because the discussion around what is remote friendly, remote first, what is a real hybrid organization is so tough in today's organizations, because the feeling that I get with many of the projects that I'm involved in is that we are sort of stuck with the discussion about is it 3 days or 2 days at the office. And that is also when I look into the LinkedIn feed, a lot of the discussion is around whether we allow 3 days mobile working or home working or not. But hybrid work and the different grades of what is a hybrid organization, what we allow is much more. And therefore, welcome with me on the stage, on the show again, Line Morkbak, connecting from the United States. Hi, Line.
Hello, good morning from here. I'm sitting here with my morning coffee.
It is 7:30 at Line's, and imagine that. Thank you so much, Line, for doing the super effort to wake up at that early time.
You're welcome. Well, I work globally, so this is the name of the game. I've done this for many years.
Thank you very much. Fantastic. Line, it is great having you back here because you have been working for how many years as a remote work consultant or hybrid strategist?
Oh, well, I've been in this space doing remote probably 16, 17 years. I'm going to age myself now. But yes, I've been doing it for a while. Of course, it looks very different now, the landscape now after the pandemic. But working with hybrid models within global organizations, I've been doing that for a long time now. Yes.
If you think back, Lina, when you started working, and I do know that we have sort of a common starting field, let's say, so it is the intercultural field. Both of us were involved in theater as well. We have many common colleagues and friends, which is a lot of fun to just realize that. If you think back 16 years ago, what was it about when you talked about remote work with organizations? What were the questions? If you just let us know a little bit.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. What were some of the things that was front of mind in the beginning? I mean, I think the conversation has always been around tools. I mean, we used to be doing, WebEx and Adobe Connect. And way before that, we were doing Skype, right? And the first book I actually wrote was a Skype book because it was a person who was in a different part of the world. And a big part of that book project was something that was just happening online. And when those conversations were coming out first, I'm like, I can't believe you wrote this book without being close to your co-author. And because we were both living globally and had an international career in life, it came natural to us. But it didn't come natural to typically the colleagues that I have. That was how we were coming together with our publisher, as well as in the interviews we were doing around the world for this book. So it was more surprise back then. And I would say some of the challenges that organizations had back there was some of the same challenges we have now, unfortunately. But as I said, they were different where they were with the tools. And I think we were in a place where there's like, oh, tools are not going to be able to solve this problem. So there was a lot of angst and anxiety around we're not in the same room with people, where now I think we've gotten into a place and have some experiences with our tools like, oh, there's actually a lot of things these tools can do. They can compensate for when we're not in the same space. And they can also, which is where I'm most passionate about when we're working hybrid and when we're working remote, is that they can also enhance a completely different part of how we are typically working in the face-to-face space. So it's opening up a new area of how we can collaborate together. That conversation did not at all happen, 15, 16 years ago. At that point, it was all about compensating for what we don't have. I do see traces of that still, many places, that we're trying to compensate instead of truly opening the floodgates and saying like, wow, we're just in a new place in terms of how we can collaborate.
Absolutely. I can't agree more. So when I started researching new ways of working 10 years ago, I experienced a very similar pattern questions or discussions that we were having with researcher colleagues or companies that we were consulting with. Thanks a lot for sort of elaborating a little bit on that. Let me jump into the discussion. We're talking today about what different versions of hybrid or remote do exist. And I pulled in the words of remote first, remote friendly, remote-ish, async first, because I do have the feeling that there's still a little bit of confusion out there, particularly when we talk and consult with organizations on what should they really aim at or look for. Is there sort of a journey that they could follow, or certain degrees, different levels of remote work? How would you describe that, Aline, for us?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of like trendy words out there right now in terms of like, yes, we are a remote first organization, or we have a remote first culture. And I do see there's a lot of degrees of what that means. The organizations that I work with, and also the organizations that I learn from and study what they're doing that are truly remote first, are the organizations who actually were built as a remote company first. I have not really seen brick and mortar organizations truly move in and adapting that remote first mindset yet. I think it's coming, because they're studying those organizations who started as remote first to see where that comes, how to build that same kind of culture. Most organizations are going from where you were used to having a portion of us being face to face. How do we now make sure that we're having this remote first setup? And remote first, in my opinion, is that we are fully set up to, on a dime, to be able to do things remote instead of waiting for us starting to be in proximity with each other. So everything is set up to be dialed in 100% on the remote scale. Primarily, that happened that consists of two different things, and that is having the tools, having that suite of tools set up that are working, primarily being everything is documented in the cloud. Everything is digitalized. Everything that of our manuals, how we're onboarding people, how we're connecting to each other, that has an online component. If we are in the office, then we would just use those online apps and that online component. But it's the baseline is that it's set up like that. Like there's nothing in an archive drawer anywhere. Whenever you're dialing into a meeting, that's a meeting that has a virtual setup. And if you happen to connect with that virtual setup in a physical space, then you're a hybrid meeting. But else, the first setup is just it's a remote meeting setup, right? So that's the biggest part of it. And then the other part is the mindset, and that is that we're thinking that first.
Absolutely. And I think it's so essential what you're saying there. And it just reminds me of a conversation I had with one of my clients. It's a rather traditional Austrian company. And we started working with top management on a definition what does hybrid work means, to establish sort of a common understanding at top level only to start with. And one of the C-level managers told me, well, Barbara, you know what? I think it's really very uncomfortable with all those remote workers, because I feel like that they are abusing of their in-office colleagues. And I was like, what do you mean? How can they abuse of their in-office colleagues? And he was like, I do see so often that they call in from home, and their in-office colleagues, they have to run around and look for archives or some folders, and they have to sort of send them back to them or tell them what is written there. And they use them like marionettes. And that is totally unfair, because you're saying to me, we need to sort of think more about the remote ones. But in this case, I think we need to protect the in-office ones. And I was like, but don't you think that the problem starts somewhere else? Because it is not remote first, it's not the realist, right? Exactly. And it was really such a fun conversation we had afterwards, because he was describing this as the brutal, the bad remote workers calling in because they're too lazy to gather things by themselves, right? And not understanding
they can't access them because it wasn't set up. So it's kind of like shifting that whole mindset of like, if we want, because remote, like, So this is where we're getting into, because I think that was one of the things we were talking about also, like what is even the differences between the remote and then hybrid. Now people are using it interchangeable, and I think that's very, very dangerous. It is to be remote, and fully remote is very, very different than if we are hybrid. And when we are doing the combo, which is what this Austrian organization is balancing and navigating, is that we're having some people in the office at some days, and then we're having some people who are in other locations, which means that they are connecting virtually with their colleagues in the office, or in a third place, right? Like it's some people are co-located and some people are not in that same location and connecting remotely. And part of that is to have that whole thing set up, having that so that we can navigate that. When you have a kind of how hybrid was in the old days and how it still is in traditional organizations, like it sounds like this Austrian company, is that you have a headquarter culture that's still set in the physical, and they're in the physical building, and they're still kind of thinking about, like, they have the real estate mindset, they have the like in office mindset, and they're dictating the work premises for the other colleagues. So when we're shifting that around, it becomes everything is remote, and then it doesn't matter who is in the office and who's dialing in. But these organizations are typically still kind of headquartered focused. And it's kind of stepping us into one of the things that hybrid is completely splintering, is that the traditional way of looking at international companies, you're still going to have a headquarter culture that's kind of dictating time of meetings, often the language of what we're doing business, and also that a certain amount of people are going to be in the office, and then we have colleagues who are also in Bangalore, so they'll be dialing in. So that's because it's our international colleagues, and they're typically an office that got set up after headquarters, right? So there's a whole line of history within our organization, and it's built first with that physically building that headquarters. So when we're looking at hybrid, how we can enhance it now, we want to think of offices in many different locations, physical offices, co-working places, hubs that we maybe have. That's our physical locations for some people. Sometimes it's people from headquarters who go to those locations. Sometimes it's people in your Indian office, who's your Indian colleagues, who are going to be in a space in their physical location. And then there's going to be some remote workers from that Austrian location who's dialing in, for example. Right? Like, so that's when hybrid comes. It's different who is going to be physical together, and that's going to change who's going to be dialing in. Then we're having a truly hybrid organization who can use that navigating back and forth. And I'm glad you're pulling up this little model. And can you zoom in a little bit on it, maybe?
I'll do that immediately. Yes.
Okay. So this is a model that Linda Creighton presented in a Harvard Business Review article from last summer, and I really thought it's spot on, and I use it in a lot of my own work in sort of describing where does hybrid bring us. So if it's a grid where you have place on one end and you have time on the bottom axis down there, and you can see what's in the teal there is like the traditional office is 9 to 5. So that's when you're having constraints around place. You're in the physical office. You also have constraints around time. We're having set hours that we start working with. When we then had our pandemic, or organizations that start working more remotely, then we're going up the axis around place. And then we're saying, oh, we could actually work anywhere within those time hours of 9 to 5. So now we're up above there, right, on place. It's like, oh, we could be anywhere. Like, I'm still dialing into the office. I'm that satellite who are connecting to headquarters, but the 9 to 5 is kind of that headquarter mentality. Then when we go down the axis, then we can go say, well, now we're looking at place. It could be now we're looking at time down the bottom, and we always been navigating that a little bit. Say I have to take my kid to the dentist, so I have to leave a little bit early. I might go into the office and be in the office at 7:30 that day because I have to leave at 3 to take him to the dentist. So I'm in the office, but I'm stretching that office hours a little bit. Okay, so that's our time axis down the bottom. What we're really doing with hybrid is that we're kind of doing that big jump into like, now we can splinter both the time and the place. Well, we are now going to be in a global organization typically, which means that time zones are going to be different. So it's not just 9 to 5, and it's not just that place. That's the physical place. It could be remote. It could be the physical place. It could be a hub. It could be a co-working place. It can be my home office, right? Like, so with hybrid, we're now getting into a whole different ball game, in my opinion, compared to when we're just talking all remote.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Lina, for clarifying on that. And I think also what another word that is very much out there is about being remote friendly, which is nothing less than giving the possibility to work remotely, do some home office, maybe 2-3 times a day, which means being remote friendly, but being not remote first. And I think there is a huge difference there. Let's see a little bit into our participants. Hi, Robert. I see for you it's much later there in Hong Kong, 11:30. So totally the other end of the world. Lovely to see you here as well. Hi, James. And we see also Furkan is joining us. Thank you very much, Furkan. And Benjamin joining again from Vienna. Thanks so much. Finally, some time to learn new perspective. Absolutely. Let's also see some expert opinions. And maybe, I'm not sure, Lena, if you also know Ursula. She's also coming out of the theater field. Let's see what Ursula is asking. In hybrid sessions, I've noticed that those sitting together face to face feel obliged to give continuous attention to those calling in. It is at the least very sensitive, the installation of screens, etc. Any tips experience with the hybrid owl, the meeting owl, probably you're meaning, right?
Yes. So good point. And I'm glad to hear that actually the people who are in the room are being very conscious of checking in with their colleagues who are dialing in remotely. Some of the things I think is important when we are working with in that combo of the hybrid meeting. I think the hybrid meeting is probably where it gets most challenging to do hybrid work practices, because we're going to have people in the office together or in a physical space together, and then other colleagues dialing in. And I'm glad that you are using the meeting owl. It is one of the tools that I think works really well when we're having hybrid meetings. Just lately, it hasn't been with the meeting owl versions that I have had, but just last week I heard someone feeling that the owl didn't have the greatest audio options, and that I think is some of the older version. Not that I want to pitch buying a newer one, but of course any product is always going to be improving constantly, right? So when we are working with the meeting owl, I think it's important that we get set up so the owl actually can totally do its 360. So the great thing about that video camera is to get a bigger sense of the space, instead of everyone just going to set up in a grid. You get that more sense of space when you're the person who's dialing in. I've been playing around using the hybrid space also to represent the people who are dialing in, have them being represented in the space. So have a little, sometimes have another laptop or another tablet where they're actually their faces on, or their video camera is on, or even just a chair or a little note that's pulled in. I was just working with some folks out of Lego, and they actually were building little representations of themselves
with Lego.
Of little Lego. So when they're not in the office, their colleagues can take the one that Jacob built about himself and sit in front of him and be like, oh, Jacob is present. And, like Irma over here is also present. And, different people are present, and they built their own little representations out of Legos. So
I love that idea.
Creative ways that we can start playing around with this.
I love that, Lina. Beautiful example. My experience is that I also had teams that use sort of pictures on chairs of that person, but I always had the feeling that people still, if there's not a computer where you can see that person starts to move the lips when he or she wants to say something, I think the computer, at least in my perception, was always most effective if there is enough space to sort of put them all in together into sort of this round table setup. Here is the link to the meeting owl for those of you who are not so familiar with that tool yet, I also have very, very good experiences. And I talked in one of my previous sessions with Nancy Settle-Murphy, and I think she told me she even had a company who was sort of really cutting out in carton and putting a face on that carton puppy or carton sort of representation of someone.
It's
But I
fun to
love the
hear how
logo.
creative people are being. And I think that it just creates a playfulness around it, but it also very almost tactical gets it like, hey, we need to solve this. We need to find ways to do this. And I love when it becomes something that we're manipulating with our hands. So we're not just relying on the tech to do it. We're actually like, how can we cut and paste and glue something, or, and build something with Legos that gives us into this space of a bridge, of kind of overcoming some of these barriers, right? And overcoming the bias. So that's one of the things that Ursula was also kind of hinting on here, that we have this in-person bias when we are together in the same space, and at least the stage we all are all at right now, we have to for a while try to see if we can overcome that, as we are getting more and more comfortable navigating in the remote setting with our colleagues, so that at some point we might have like a remote bias. But right now, I think we're primarily hardwired in terms of like having an in-person bias, right? And proximity, right? Just in terms of who's closest to us.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Lena. Well, let's pick up here on Benjamin's comment. Benjamin is saying, I've noticed that a high barrier for going international full remote seems to be payroll and tax liabilities that may be created for the employer. Any advice for a company thinking about creating a full remote organization?
Good question. Very good question, Benjamin. Well, I'm seeing there's certain countries that are having more remote friendly setups and are kind of geared towards that. I think Ireland, as well as one of I forget if it's Estonia or Lithuania, but some of those countries by the Baltic Sea also having like an even more kind of, they've been just from getting set up as an international company, have really have some more remote friendly setups. But I think it is tricky. I know that when when Spotify made their whole model where you could actually work from pretty much any location, as you were hired new at Spotify, but even existing colleagues within Spotify, they had some restrictions, and I think that was in terms of taxation and legislation. Actually, no, I don't. I would typically in those situations be working with a lawyer to pull in and support organizations there, because it's a bit of a minefield. I mean, organizations have always been, most global organizations are already incorporated in more than one country, so it would be piggybacking on that. And in my own personal experience, I've definitely been in previous part of my career, I've been working within international organizations, and then as I moved locations, my contract had to change depending on where I had work permits and also where I was located. So you might have to change people's contracts. So some of that can be like, can we just have people be nomads and live in many different locations? Some organizations do it, but I think a lot of that is actually on the individual employee. I mean.
I can also post later on, Benjamin, a few sort of companies, because of course we also know that there are all the companies specialized on that tax aspect, and we're going to tag them into the feed so that that we can exchange more on who could be sort of an outsourced partner to look into that more deeply. Yeah. Vincent is also saying the danger of fully remote. If your job can be done fully remotely, it can also be outsourced to lower wage countries. One of the benefits, because we can also apply for any job outside of our geographical area, for example, but clearly there are also some disadvantages.
But I would say that outsourcing also happened before hybrid, right? I mean, that's been happening for the last 20 years, which is why we're having teams coming in of, other locations, right? And we're having certain service centers or in certain locations, right? I think with where we're actually going now with our tools, our suite of tools, and also the mindset that it doesn't have to be a certain function has to be in this location, that it can be like any function can be anywhere. And what we're seeing here in the US job market is that more and more it becomes that jobs being posted is like, West, there is a remote option here. You can be in this office, you can be in this office, or you can be remote. And that more and more people are saying, well, that means I don't have to try and find a very expensive place to live in the Bay Area. I could still live in Ohio, I could still live in Texas, I could still live somewhere else and have that job without having necessarily having the rent that would be for the Bay Area or would be in another tech hub, right?
But there were already some conversations in companies who then want to cut the salary, right? Because people live outside of the expensive city. So it's always, I think it's going to be an ongoing discussion there where we still don't have a right question or the one only the one only answer for it, but rather to continue thinking about how this sort of world of work, new way of working could look like. And just to come back to the outsource aspect or the outsourcing to a low wage country, as Robert is saying, I think that's a very good example for other jobs like live virtual workshops like this one. Personal style experience is hard to replicate. And of course, this also sort of kicks in here. Thanks a lot, Robert, for participating. Lena, we have one more question that is just about the definition part of today's topic. So we talked about remote friendly, remote first. Why is async, or what is async first, and why is async first so important? Asynchronous communication.
Yes. And I think this is one of those buzzwords that's also coming out, like what is even asynchronous? And just to define that for people who may be like, oh, I'm just hearing it all the time and I think I know what it is. So what we're doing right now is synchronous. Like Barbara and I are tuned into this platform at the same time. We're compensating with our time zones differences, but we're tuned in at the same time. So that's synchronous. When we're doing something asynchronous, is that we're collaborating together at any time. So typically our emails would be asynchronous, any online board that we're collaborating in. If I'm sending an article and say, oh, can we discuss this on Tuesday's meeting, and I'm sending it out in an email or sending it out in Slack 3 days ahead of time, that's an asynchronous way of sharing that article with colleagues, and then we're discussing it at our synchronous meeting on Tuesday. So so we've always done that. Any attachment we send to an email that's an asynchronous. But to really do having an asynchronous mindset is to do that as the first off the bat, and is to expand asynchronous to way beyond email. Because even though email is asynchronous, unfortunately, we're not using it very well as an asynchronous tool, because there is something, most of us feel very stressed with our email. We have to respond at a certain time, and sometimes there's certain company cultures where you have to respond immediately, and then it's not an asynchronous. Then we're not using the asynchronous benefits of email, right? Like using an online board is probably the best way of thinking asynchronous, and that is like, oh, this board is open. We're brainstorming. We're adding thoughts into this. We are negotiating what agenda is going to happen for that Tuesday meeting. And that is happening since Friday, over the weekend, on Monday and Tuesday morning, until we're doing that meeting at Tuesday at noon or whatever. And that is the asynchronous way of then collaborating. And that means for my colleague, Asim out of Bangalore, he's going to be doing that my Sunday. I will be doing it this Monday morning as I'm dialing in and starting my workday. So it's compensating over those time zone differences. And the asynchronous is also giving a different voice to different temperaments and different ways of working. Many of us like to add things, thoughts when we're hearing other people's opinions. So if I can see what other people are thinking the last 2 or 3 days on this online board, that gets me thinking. So when we're doing something synchronously, we're like, oh, let's just brainstorm. What's your thoughts? What's my thoughts? We're doing it verbally typically. We're doing it in one language, unless we're having language apps that's translating, where typically there's one company language that's overriding. For a lot of people it's going to be English, right? Which means that many people in a global organization are translating in their heads. So we're honoring kind of the extroverts, the ones who are maybe native speakers of that language, the people who are comfortable just speaking out right on and maybe also the people who have a higher title or more seniority in the organization. So there's a lot of power dynamics sometimes that gets played into that. When we're in the asynchronous, we can kind of deflate that a little bit, because we are expanding the input for when that dialogue is happening. People who are translating have times to translate. They can bounce ideas off each other. They're not interrupting anybody, and no one is. Maybe it's an anonymous board. No one can see who's putting what in. So the asynchronous, this is an example of how you're doing some of these asynchronous collaborations. And so that is what asynchronous first is, that we are thinking those methods first. When we're setting up a discussion, when we're inviting in for a brainstorm, when we're negotiating that meeting, or we're getting ready to make that decision.
But now we do know, Lena, out of our work with organizations, the experience that we have and research shows us that there are many benefits of remote first, of giving the possibility to communicate asynchronously, though we do see that there are some roadblocks to remote or hybrid work. So when it comes to those roadblocks, what would you suggest, or what are those roadblocks in the first moment, and then what would you suggest to overcome them in the organization?
Yes. So if we first talk about fully remote, if we're not talking the hybrid option, but just remote, I think many of us, as we've been part of the pandemic and been forced to be remote. So again, what our experience of being remote during a pandemic was forced. It wasn't by choice, and there was no planning. The organization didn't plan. The teams didn't plan. So there, I think one of the key things that are a roadblock is that people finding themselves very isolated. They're feeling out of touch. Those extroverts who want to, or who are people persons, they are missing that juicy connections with their colleagues. Managers who are used to like walking down the hallway, getting a sense of their colleagues, seeing them in the coffee corner, seeing them down in cafeteria, getting a sense of their team, because they're good at managing by walking around. They really felt robbed of that when they were all remote. And so those are some of those biggest roadblocks, is that we're finding ourselves isolated, that we're finding ourselves so isolated personally, and then out of touch with our team and out of touch with our colleagues. So a lot of issues around knowledge sharing not happening. It's like, I'm not new people got hired in, I don't know what the expertise are. Those people who did that great project with that client, I heard of it, but I never really understood what happened. What can I learn from it? Can I build on that project? Can I not? Knowledge kind of disappearing down in a black hole, because it just sits with that person and we're not bumping into them. So we're being left out of conversations. And then also some of the people who are not used to working in a global setting as much also felt that the time zones really was kind of hard, right? They're like, oh, I was in the office and it was the satellites who typically had to overcome the time zones differences, and now I had to too, because now we're all remote, right? So those are some of the roadblocks when we're all remote. And there, I think primarily the whole isolation, also getting feeling left out of conversations. That's important, that we're not thinking, and this is huge. This is like a huge piece of how we're thinking collaboration culture, that I think all remote ends up being that when we are having a touch point with each other, it's because there's a meeting. So we're forgetting to get things set up that's informal ways of connecting. Are we having virtual calls? Are we Monday with each other? I'm seeing there's a little bit of a delay on my end. Is the audio okay from your
I
end?
hear the audio's a little bit distorted, but I could hear you well.
Okay, good. I'm sorry. I could just kind of see a little bit of issues there. So my experience, or in my tips and the recommendations, is always for a team to go back and look at, like, what's our patterns of how we're coming together? What kind of rituals do we have set up? Are they only as a team? Are they only set up with meetings? Let's not default into meetings. When can we do peer-to-peer work with each other? When can we voluntarily just, there's 2 slots during the week or several slots during the week where we can just touch base with each other? As a team lead, where's my open office hours that anyone can just knock on my virtual door and find me? Are we maybe using like a Velo space or like a Sokoko space where me as a manager or a team lead, I can actually walk around the office and I can see where people are and I can knock on their doors and see, how are you working? So to really making sure that how we're collaborating doesn't get pulled into these silos where we're all in our little work offices at home alone, right? So I think that's one of the biggest issues, and one of the ways that we need to create a pattern with our team and be very conscious that that happens naturally when we're face-to-face together. When we're remote, we have to be intentional about setting it up, negotiating it as colleagues. How do we want those touch points to be? When we're remote, when we're hybrid, there's a couple of other roadblocks. One of the roadblocks, which is the isolation, is less of, because hybrid is the when we're then once in a while choosing to have these touch points face to face, right? So we are probably saying, well, we're finding out in our team, when do we want, what should our in-person cadence be? How often do we want to be in person? All of us, and subgroups and projects, and have that laid out so we all know, well, oh, that project team, they're always in on Wednesdays, or as a whole team, we're in twice a month, and we all prioritize that, and we have a calendar so we know who's in the office at what time, and we can then say, oh, I know that project team is always in on that day. I want to touch base with her anyway. I'm going to come in that day as well. So the isolation we can definitely overcome in the hybrid setting. The challenging piece, the biggest kind of roadblock in the hybrid, is that we do not do that negotiation. I think where the hybrid really get complicated is that it's kind of free for all. It's a free choice. If we're thinking back to that diagram we looked at before, we're out here anywhere, anytime, and any place at any time. So it becomes a constant negotiation with each other in a team. Well, I'm not going to go in and do those early mornings, because now that I'm choosing, the reason I'm working from home today is that I need to have, I want to go for a run, or I need to get certain things, take care of things in my personal household. That's why I don't do my commute today. So if you're then asking me to do something specifically at 8:00, that doesn't work for me, because that's the reason I'm working from home today, right? So suddenly we have to do these kind of personal negotiations with each other. There's a reason that we're doing hybrid, and that's because it fits our personal choice. So now those personal choices becomes something we're sharing with our team. So we actually get very intimate and personal with our colleagues. And that's where I see hybrid getting complicated. And I also see that's where hybrid managers are challenged, because they now suddenly start negotiating and having some more personal, intimate conversation with their team that they're not used to, because when you're in the work is 9 to 5 in this physical office, all those negotiations are not happening. You just show up in those hours, and that's when we do the work.
Absolutely, Lina. Thank you so much. I think those are very important and valuable points that you're making there. Let me just check if I can hear somebody replying me back to my messages, because I did have some sort of distortion in your audio. I'm not sure if it's on my end or it's at your end, because I heard you not very well the last few minutes. So let's see if somebody could maybe type that back and give us sort of a thumbs up if the audio is only bad at my end. So no problem, because you're still hearing properly. Anyways, we are at the end already today. We discussed a super important topic about remote work, hybrid work, and I really hope that sort of this also helps many of you out there to become more clear about how you should approach this conversation in your organizations. Okay, so I see that I'm clear, but Vincent, maybe it's the noise with with Lina. So
On
Lina,
my
I'm
end.
sorry, I think there's something with your audio then.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Don't
Yes.
worry, don't worry. Thank you very much. We already tackled so many points there about remote friendly, about remote first being remotish, being async first, that I really hope, and thank you very much for all of you also providing us with your questions. And Lena, for you sort of being such an early bird. Dear God, you had to wake up probably at 7 a.m., right? The latest.
I was up at 6 and did yoga and then got ready for this.
Mamma mia. Okay, thank you very much. I see that it's people are hearing me properly. Maybe Lena, that you're going to have an audio check afterwards.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I hope you got enough of it, and that Barbara, you typically write this out and it becomes a post at some point as well, right?
Exactly. So stay tuned. We're going to produce afterwards a blog post, a social media post, and we're going to produce a podcast out of this conversation. I just hope that my podcast producer is really able to sort of clean up the last 5 to 10 minutes. But it was only the last 5 to 10 minutes. Thanks a lot, Rob, also for that comment. So, Lena, thank you so much for being with us here. And you know that I have a virtual cocktail prepared for you backstage, and we still have to talk about some upcoming dates. So I'll see you there in a bit. But I leave you with a big thank you for joining me again on the Virtual Space Hero stage.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Virtual Space Heroes, thank you so much for joining in, for providing us with your questions, with your suggestions about who should be on this stage. And with that, I'm going to leave you now for today, whether it is morning, afternoon, or a good night in Hong Kong. Thanks a lot. And don't forget to become a virtual space hero. And with that, have a beautiful morning, afternoon, good night. Bye.